Hello and welcome. You're watching W News, broadcasting live from the Al Arabiya News headquarters. I'm Sarah Coates.
I'm Tom Burgess-Watson.
Coming up on the program, Donald Trump begins to assemble his top team at the White House, including his so-called ice maiden, Susie Wiles. She'll make history as the country's first female in the senior position.
Meanwhile, Vladimir Putin sends his congratulations to the president-elect, revealing both him and Trump are ready to talk. And will America's so-called special relationship with the UK remain special? The former British Chancellor, Nadhim Zahawi, joins us in the studio as he reveals if the current British government is ready to mend fences with Washington. Big show coming up tonight, Tom. We'll be discussing, of course, everything Trump, who he'll be assembling. Very, very interesting. Absolutely. Some new faces, some familiar faces, some less familiar faces. We'll be talking all about that throughout the course of this evening. But it has, of course, been 3 days since the US voted Donald Trump as their next president. Well, as a new Republican regime returns to the White House, one woman, Susie Wiles, nicknamed the Ice Maiden, is expected to take up the role as Trump's new chief of staff, taking on the most senior advisory role in the Oval Office. And the first woman to do so in history. Well,
during his victory speech, Trump singled her out for her dedication on the campaign. Here's a reminder of what he said.
Let me also express my tremendous appreciation for Susie and Chris, the job you did. Susie, come here. Come here, Susie. Chris, come here, Chris. Susie likes to stay sort of in the back, let me tell you. The Ice Maiden, we call her the Ice Maiden.
And for more, our correspondent Simon Marks is standing by in Washington. Simon, lovely to have you on. Firstly, tell me, what do we know about Susie Wiles? Who is she and what is her backstory?
Well, her backstory, Sarah, is entirely steeped in Florida politics. She ran Donald Trump's Florida campaign in 2016. So that's when she first came to his attention. She also worked with the Florida governor, Ron DeSantis, falling out with Ron DeSantis at one point, which is how she came to be part of Donald Trump's campaign in the Sunshine State. She is highly regarded there, viewed as a consummate strategist. To the point that even the former governor of Florida, Jeb Bush, brother, of course, of George W. Bush, the former American president, part of a family that has no real truck with Donald Trump or the Make America Great Again movement that he leads, congratulated Donald Trump on social media yesterday on selecting Susie Wiles for this particular job. And the reason why this appointment is such a big deal is not just because she's a consummate outsider as far as Washington, D.C. is concerned. She's never held a position in this town, much less anything as high profile as being White House chief of staff, but because by selecting her, Donald Trump is sending a message that he is not going to find common cause in a second term in government, as he did in 2016, with the kind of the careerists, the insiders, the people that really understand how to navigate the corridors of power in Washington, D.C., but don't necessarily agree with his particular populist-infused right-wing ideological philosophy. He is looking to staff this entire government when he arrives here in January only with proven Make America Great Again believers. And in Susie Wiles, he has found a figure who, making history as the first woman to occupy the role of White House Chief of Staff, is, I think, going to symbolize for many people, not only in the Trump inner circle, but here in Washington, that when he gets here, it's an entirely new day in American governance.
And of course, when Trump singled Wiles out in his speech, I think it's fair to say that she didn't look terribly comfortable in the limelight. And I'm imagining that's going to have to change with her new position.
Well, she's definitely not comfortable in the limelight. I mean, there's a point where in the early hours of Wednesday morning, he encourages her to step up to the microphone and make a few remarks. And she absolutely eschews the idea and goes back sort of into the shadows at the back of that stage at the West Palm Beach Convention Center where Donald Trump was celebrating victory. She's not interested in being a public figure. But the truth of the matter is that's another reason why Donald Trump wants her for this job. I mean, he had White House chiefs of staff in his first term in office who turned out to be public figures, including people like General John Kelly, who in the dying days of this election campaign said that he believed that Donald Trump had fascistic tendencies. It is unusual for people in the role of White House chief of staff to play a public-facing role. I mean, it's supposed to be about controlling the president's diary, the president's calendar, and critically controlling access to the president, deciding who gets to walk into the Oval Office at any point to talk to the President of the United States, and critically, who does not. So it is unusual in a way for the White House chief of staff to be this kind of public figure, giving interviews, talking to Americans. And I think Donald Trump, again, by selecting Susie Wiles, is further signaling that everything is going to change at the White House, certainly as far as his second term in office is concerned, versus the first term experience from 2016 to 2020.
And Simon, circling back to her being the first woman, there have been allegations of America being politically sexist, not voting for a female leader in the past. But Susie is the first woman to hold a position like this. Does that show that Donald Trump is more focused on equality than we may have given him credit for?
Well, I think you'll be able to judge that when you take a look at his cabinet and see how many women are sitting around the table. He did have women in his first cabinet, including Linda McMahon, the head of the Small Business Administration in Trump's first term, who is now playing a major role in the transition down at Mar-a-Lago. And we know that there are other women in his life that have been very influential, including during the first term, his daughter Ivanka, and arguably throughout his political career, the woman who's about to become First Lady of the United States all over again, Melania Trump. I mean, it is Melania Trump who told Donald Trump in 2015 that if he made the decision to enter the presidential race, he would win. She was absolutely certain of that. And while there is obviously tremendous national and international speculation about precisely what the state of the Trump marriage may be, she remains an important voice in his ear on matters political. So I think that by selecting Susie Wiles, he's breaking a glass ceiling down there at the White House. But I think he would argue that in Susie Wiles, he believes he has found the right woman for the job because of the way she has co-chaired his campaign nationally throughout the last year and a half.
Always great to have you on, our correspondent, Simon Marks. Thank you.
Well, as we've been discussing, Susie Wiles is said to be one of the most powerful women in America when she becomes part of Trump's top team.
But does she deserve the nickname Ice Maiden, and what is she really like in real life? Well, let's speak to Republican strategist in Florida and the CEO of Policy Standard, Riz Khan. Mr. Khan, thank you very much for joining us. You operate and work in Florida. Firstly, what sort of a reputation does Wiles have on the political scene?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me. Susie has an incredible reputation in Tallahassee. She runs one of the biggest firms in Tallahassee. They do some of the most revenue. She runs that firm, and she doesn't, if she sends somebody into the Capitol to lobby on a bill, they are very, very difficult to say no to. She gets what she wants 95% of the time.
And a lot is being made about this Ice Maiden nickname. In your opinion, does she deserve it?
Well, she's had that nickname for a long, long time. That's not, I mean, Trump's obviously the president is obviously making saying it on stage like that makes it a bigger splash, but she's had that name a long time because she's very calculating. She's extremely calculating. She's extremely intelligent, and she doesn't mind to throw an elbow when she needs to throw an elbow to get the policy accomplished. She's also not the the warm, passionate, cry, all the emotions. She is about data. She's about she's calculating.
So do you think it's fair to say we're talking about quite different styles between Trump and Wiles? And if you think that's the case, do you think we could be talking about a pretty complementary sort of a relationship here?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, they are very complementary. Donald Trump, we all know how he is, and he's the New Yorker. He's very brash and bull in a china shop. Susie Wiles will complement that fantastically because she gets the job done without being part of the story. And she's going to take what the president tells her to do and go accomplish it, and nothing's going to get in her way. The DC establishment, the swamp is not going to stop her from accomplishing the prerogatives of this administration.
And the fact that she is a woman as chief of staff, in your opinion, how significant is this?
Well, Donald Trump has a very long history of empowering women, as much as a lot of the media doesn't report on that. He consistently wants to find the best person for a role, and he doesn't really care if that's a woman, a man, someone of different racial complexion. He wants the best person for the job, and when he finds that person, he doesn't let go of them. He wants that person. He will make them an offer they can't refuse, and there we are. But if that person's a woman, he's happy to empower them. He's happy to. A lot of women who have worked for the Trump organization over the years have mentioned how he'll give them time to go spend with their kids, to balance life, to do all the things, so long as they're actually productive and accomplishing the goals that he is setting forth.
And Chris, just to remind us, I mean, really for the benefit of our viewers, what the role of Chief of Staff is all about and what sort of powers are wielded by the Chief of Staff.
Yeah, so I would argue that the Chief of Staff of the United States, the President's Chief of Staff, is the second most powerful position in the world. It's more powerful than Vice President. It's more powerful than Secretary of Defense or being a general, because you do control the access, you do control the calendar, you do influence a lot of what the president gets to hear. And that's why I think Susie is such a fantastic pick for this, because she's going to be a gatekeeper in a way that is not influencing the president towards a certain policy objective. She's going to put the people the president needs to hear on, crises domestically or internationally. She's going to make sure that the actual experts, the actual data is presented to him in a logical way so he can make a decision and move forward, not try to put the thumb on the scale of what decision ought to be made.
This election has been altogether good news for your state. Do you expect to see more people from your state taking key roles?
Absolutely. From your mouth to God's ears, absolutely. Florida and Susie should be the first pick, and I think that's a really good sign that we're going to see Senator Marco Rubio become the Secretary of State. I believe in British circles it's the Foreign Minister, right? And then we're going to see possibly like Congressman Brian Mast, if there's enough room in Congress to kind of take him out of Congress for a 90-day stint and hold a special election for his seat. If we could take Brian Mast, make him Secretary of Veterans Affairs, he's a double amputee. He'd be wonderful at that position. If Senator Rubio is Secretary of State, that does open up that seat to then be appointed by Ron DeSantis, who could possibly appoint himself, or he could appoint his wife. So there's a lot of there's certainly I mean, there's 2,500 positions. There's ambassadorships that have to be appointed. The transition is a monolithic task. And with somebody so entranced in Tallahassee politics at the helm of not just the transition, but the administration, you're going to see a lot of Florida talent promoted into key roles in D.C.
Yeah, and Chris, it's a pretty lengthy process, isn't it, putting together a whole team? I mean, when do you think Trump will have finished this whole process of putting together that new administration?
Well, I think this is a very different scenario than 2016. I think 2016, he was not prepared for the amount of appointments. He was not prepared for who to trust. I think he's used to having a really hands-on approach, and that's just not something you can do when you have this many appointees in this short period of time. And that's, again, the key of putting key people in place like Susie, putting her as chief of staff and saying, all right, hey, Susie, get with the vice president and fill, all of these. I just want to worry about the top 12. I want to worry about the top 20, and limiting himself to worrying about, the direct cabinet and not the director of the FBI or the undersecretary of assistant deputy of health. All of these are political appointments, or who the ambassador to Nigeria is. Like these decisions can be brought to him by Susie, and probably Susie can delegate that down further. And that's, I think, the real excitement about this administration, is that this is an administration that is prepared to delegate, and not to delegate to the party that the established party that we had back in 2016 that wanted to circumvent a lot of the goals of the administration. This time you're going to delegate to people who are completely bought in and on board in accomplishing the goals of the president.
And Chris, just finally, Florida were 30 electoral college votes. Were you ever in doubt?
Absolutely not. No. We took Miami-Dade County. We took Hillsborough County. We took Osceola County. Every single county moved in a more Republican direction. There was never any concern that Florida was in play. Yeah, and it's certainly never going to be in play in the future. I mean, we are a more Republican state than Texas at this point in time. We're the third largest state in the union. Make America Florida is what we need to be doing.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Chris Licata, great to have you with us.
Russian President Vladimir Putin has congratulated Donald Trump on his election win, calling him a courageous man. Now, with Trump back in the Oval Office, we're reminded of his signature approach to foreign policy, building personal connections with world leaders, whether they're America's friends or foes. Now, Trump's frequent praise for Putin has often raised eyebrows at home, and on Putin's side, he said he's open for more talks. However, Putin made it clear that his conditions to end the war in Ukraine remain firm. Ukraine must ditch its NATO ambitions and pull out its troops from 4 regions Russia now claims.
So while the negotiation door is open between Russia and the United States, Putin's demands in Ukraine may seem pretty unhinged to some people. Well, joining us to talk about the return of the Trump-Putin dynamic is Thomas Pickering, former US ambassador to Russia. Thank you very much indeed for joining us here, Ambassador. Vladimir Putin has, of course, congratulated Donald Trump on his win, also praising him for showing courage during the assassination attempt, referring to him as a real man, and also saying he's ready to talk. The pair seem pretty close, don't they?
They are, and of course there's something to be gained politically for each of them in working that particular set of issues. Putin gains the kind of respect that he's lost through the invasion, the aggressive invasion of Ukraine, and the starting of a war that most people in the world community doubt was justified. And Trump is seeking to gain the notion that he has inordinate influence, and that his promise to end the Ukraine war in 24 hours is now under a test. Although Trump's strategy often is to mention large, exaggerated claims as a way of dominating the airwaves and preventing anybody through the plethora of claims and the volumes and intensity of them to question whether any of them are really true or going to come true. And it's a tactical gambit that he's succeeded in many ways in promoting his own electoral chances, I think to the surprise of many, including yours truly, in the recent election. And we all have to live with the reality. We can hope for things, but we all have to contend with how and in what way we must deal with the cards that are put out on the table, so to speak.
One thing Mr. Trump hasn't said is actually how he would end this war. We did hear, though, from J.D. Vance that getting a deal to end the war would be favourable to the Kremlin. What could we expect to see here?
I think the principal question is open now is where are the territorial boundaries at the end of the conflict through a process of either use of force or negotiation. And I believe what J.D. Vance is more than hinting at is that either the current lines of control, which are inside Ukraine's 1991 independence boundaries, or something that might go back in that direction a little further, might happen. It's been quite clear that President Zelensky understands the political danger of that and the problem that would cause him, Ukrainians, and many European Union members to have a military conflict that most will be sure is contrary to the United Nations Charter restrictions on the use of force, result in a victory for President Putin that he can exploit to his own political advantage.
So, Ambassador, could we be looking at a scenario in which Ukraine is forced to concede large chunks of its territory?
That is certainly what President Zelensky fears, what President Biden made clear he feared, and what I think others believe could lead more to a catastrophic destabilization of the region. And as you know, over the last 3 years of warfare, President Putin has hinted at the use of nuclear weapons. He's kind of pulled back a little bit from that, but has left the question very much open. And the threat to use nuclear weapons is seen certainly as creating leverage for either negotiation or for bringing more people together on his side of the agenda of prosecuting the use of force.
So how concerned should NATO countries be over Trump's comments in the past about his commitment to the alliance, saying that he'd have to look at it again?
But his commitment to the alliance in the first administration of President Trump was to take the goals that the NATO states had pledged to meet of 2% spending on defense and seek to make them an objective which hadn't been met by many NATO states to be something he wanted to have them meet. And he went so far as to say that if they didn't meet them, it would be tantamount to abandoning NATO, and that he would, in fact, adopt that approach in bringing leverage against them to meet those particular goals. So one could count that as using basically the threat to abandon NATO as a way of preserving it from one point of view. The other is it appeared to be a reckless gesture to try to achieve a personal objective of some significance, but which was not going to happen certainly quickly or overnight or necessarily in a way that ratified a new reunification of commitment and reform in NATO to defend countries like Ukraine invaded by their neighbors.
So given what you've just said there, how destabilising is all of this unpredictability with NATO and other allies?
If you concluded from what I said that it was destabilizing, you're exactly on track.
Okay. I wanted to ask you, if possible at all, about the relationship between Donald Trump and Vladimir Zelensky. It's been a bit fraught in the past, I think it's fair to say. And I'm just wondering how you see events unfolding in that regard.
Well, the famous press conference given in September last year, in which President Trump adopted the view that President Putin was correct in his conclusions about the conflict and how it started, not the U.S. intelligence community, was certainly something designed to try to pull Putin, if you could put it this way, closer into his influence orbit. And Putin's rather generous message within the last 2 days congratulating Trump has certainly borne fruit. Whether this can lead to what I consider to be a very positive conclusion is that conversations between the United States and Russia with the idea of reaching a settlement that at least can consider the ethical principles that have been violated in going to war in an outcome that can help meet those objectives. It won't make everybody perfectly happy, but it will be something that could be equitable and just, is one test. Another test is to use the supply of weapons to Ukraine to protect itself and carry out its self-defense as a lever to seek to enhance Mr. Putin's benefits as a result of any negotiation. And that would certainly have negative consequences of real significance to U.S.-European defense relationships, to NATO, to European solidarity with the United States, and indeed with perhaps driving European defense arrangements further from being coordinated and worked out closely with countries like the United States.
And while we have you, you were also an ambassador to Israel. It's obviously a crucial time. How do you feel Mr. Trump's approach should be or will be when it comes to the situation there?
Well, I think that I should also call attention to the fact that I was first an ambassador to an Arab country, Jordan, and that my view is that one doesn't take sides on the basis of the countries the U.S. has asked its officials to represent itself, but to support the U.S. and U.S. interests. And my view is U.S. interests is totally supported by the return of the hostage, totally supported by the cessation in the huge numbers of civilian deaths that have taken place in Gaza and in Lebanon, totally supported by a ceasefire. And those are the objectives we have been working on and seeking to get carried out.
And just
certainly the necessity, I believe, to consider positively something that many people disparage as being impossible, a two-state solution would be one of those keys that I think could make something like that happen, but obviously will take a great deal of time and effort, a great deal of persuasion, and a great deal of efforts to satisfy people who see dangers in those solutions, that those dangers can be overcome by peacekeeping, by monitoring, by support, where the relationships that have to be established to achieve that broken unilaterally by one side or another.
And just lastly, one of those relationships, obviously, we haven't talked about Iran yet, and we saw a tough stance towards Iran from the first Trump presidency. Do you think we're going to see more of the same in the second Trump presidency?
Well, I very much supported the idea that we should be talking to Iran with the idea of bringing about what President Obama brought about, and with the help of many people around the world, a agreement with Iran, carefully monitored and very much quietly looked after, but significantly to prevent nuclear proliferation in Iran. And I do not fathom the reason why people oppose that. It may not have been the perfect embodiment of their ambitions, but it was working. Iran had not broken the agreement. I think that's been very carefully examined and ratified by all of our understanding of that situation. And seemingly, there's now an effort somehow that Iran is all at fault in the U.S. withdrawal, which led, I think, to the destruction of something that was extremely positive and could have been improved upon, obviously, if it went ahead, but not by destroying it.
Okay, well, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us, Ambassador Thomas Pickering. Thank you.
Always an honor and a pleasure to be with you.
Moving to the United Kingdom, where there are mixed reactions with Trump's election win. The British Prime Minister Keir Starmer was among the first to call and congratulate Trump, insisting that the relationship will prosper. But critics worry about trade wars and future support on the Ukraine conflict.
Well, some other concerns are linked directly to sitting ministers, including the Foreign Secretary David Lammy, who has used harsh words to describe Trump in the past. Meanwhile, the Labour MP Emily Thornberry in 2019 called Trump a racist and a predator.
Probably the most outspoken critic of Trump, who's also a senior public official in the UK, is the Mayor of London. Trump has previously called Sadiq Khan a stone-cold loser.
Well, from not congratulating his win to expressing his fears for democracy and raising questions about the wars, the mayor issued a statement. It read, "I know that many Londoners will be anxious about the outcome of the US presidential election. Many will be fearful about what it will mean for democracy and for women's rights, or how the result impacts the situation in the Middle East or the fate of Ukraine." He went on to say, "London is and always will be for everyone. We will always be pro-women, pro-diversity, pro-climate and pro-human rights."
Let's now speak to the UK's former Chancellor of the Exchequer under the Conservatives, who can shed more light on the complex dynamic. Nadhim Zahawi, thank you so very much for joining us in the studio today. It's a real pleasure to have you here.
It's great to be with you.
Firstly, we're both wondering, what was your reaction when you heard the news that Donald Trump had won another term?
I won 2 bets. I'd been predicting a Trump win for quite a few months now. And the reason being, I think, is what many on the left have neglected, is that the cost of living and inflation, both in the United States and in the UK, actually led to the incumbent losing, and losing badly, whether it was us under Rishi Sunak in the UK a few months ago, or now Kamala Harris, indeed. And I think the idea that we sort of almost dismiss people's concerns about the cost of living, or, oh, well, aren't we doing well because look at us versus a basket of other nations, the G7 or the G20, just didn't resonate. And I think President-elect Trump had great message discipline, partly because of probably Mrs. Wiles, focused very much on the economy and the cost of living. You know, when I think someone I saw tweeting this morning saying that when a portion of Five Guys, which is a famous hamburger place in America, I think probably all over the world, is costing something like $24, you know people are hurting, and you know they're not going to vote for the incumbent. And then focusing on illegal migration, very similar issues to the United Kingdom, and indeed to Europe as well. And I think it's a great lesson for everyone. And I think actually it's a little bit disingenuous and vacuous of the Mayor of London. One, he should be focusing on delivering for Londoners. I think Londoners don't feel very safe, don't feel very well looked after by his administration. Plus, if you look at the results of the presidential election, more Latinos, more black men, and of course, more Gen Zs voted for Donald Trump. And I actually tweeted saying that, you know, for the left, do not take that young generation for granted. Do not take the Latino vote or the brown or black vote for granted. And the same is happening in England. Now, under our new leader, Kemi Badenoch, I think Keir Starmer's going to have his work cut out.
Yeah, I mean, you've mentioned something else on X or Twitter, which struck me as well. You put out a list of things that went wrong, shall we say, for the Democrats. So one of them was, don't make an enemy out of Elon Musk. Now, we spoke to his father together a couple of days ago, and he said his son's role had been pivotal in Trump's election victory. It sounds to me like you might agree with Mr. Musk Sr.
I do agree. And I think actually the mistake Kamala Harris made is to allow people around her or herself to attack Elon. People responded to my tweet by saying, oh, well, but he controls this massive media organization in X, or previously Twitter. The Democrats outspent the Trump campaign almost, I think, 2-1. They had every celebrity endorsement, including Taylor Swift, and none of it worked for her. Partly, I think, because actually annoying someone with so much energy and so much talent and focus meant that Elon spent the last few months literally just focusing on delivering Pennsylvania, for example, for the Trump campaign. But the idea that it's because of him buying X for $40 billion, the whole of the mainstream media was up against Trump. They threw the kitchen sink at Trump. And yet people, Americans, still voted for him, including, remarkably, him. None of the pollsters had this, winning the popular vote. It's quite remarkable what is happening in politics. Part of it, I think, is also driven by authenticity. Whatever you may think of him, Donald Trump will be straight talking. I've just been listening to your interviews previous to mine. World leaders will know that he doesn't mince his words. And I think that's a great strength for Trump. He's a great negotiator, and he won't miss his words, whether with Putin or with Iran.
One thing that we both found fairly interesting today, actually, when you were mentioning social media and you were mentioning the younger vote, was that his 18-year-old son gave him a fair boost in that demographic, with sort of telling him who to go on the podcasts with and that sort of thing. But in terms of the announcements that have been made today, anyone that you think deserves a top job?
I think Mike Pompeo would be a great appointment if he is willing to serve. I think that will make a huge difference, a huge talent. I always thought Mike would run himself. I actually encouraged him to run when we met in London a couple of years back now. But I think Mike would be a great appointment. I wish Mick Mulvaney might come back. I don't think he will. He'd been chief of staff, but of course he's got now Mrs. Wiles in place, which I think is a great appointment. You saw endorsements from across the board of Republicans, Rubio, Cruz, everybody endorsing her appointment, which I think is really an excellent appointment. But he's got plenty of talent now around him to be able to really make a difference this time round.
I wanted to ask you a bit about the special relationship. I don't know if you like that term, if you use that.
We do like it.
You do like it.
Very much
I'm talking about the relationship between London and Washington, of course, for the benefit of our viewers. We've got new leadership in both countries, almost in the United States, although another 2 months of the Biden administration. But what is your assessment of what the state of that special relationship is right now?
It is in rude health. I've, for a very short period of time, in between being Chancellor of the Exchequer and then chairman of the party, I ran the Cabinet Office, which included national security. Within that, the relationship of the institutions in the US and in the UK are so deep and in lockstep that it almost doesn't matter who the occupant of 10 Downing Street is or the Oval Office. It really is as close as it can possibly be, which I think is a great thing, by the way, for our two nations, and long may it continue. So I think it was good to see Keir Starmer come out very early on and take a leadership position, because some of his cabinet, David Lammy being one, Angela Rayner and others, have not been as complimentary about President-elect Trump, and it was good to see him lead his party to a very different position this time round and not allow his party, well, apart from Sadiq Khan to attack our closest ally.
What about when it comes to who you believe should be the British ambassador to Washington? It does seem as though the status quo is working out quite well right now. Dame Karen Pierce is due to leave early next year, but what do you think should happen here?
So Karen Pierce is a phenomenal operator in Washington. Best of breed, let me put it that way. She looked after me when I was Chancellor, and I visited the US and met with Janet Yellen, and in fact, Kamala Harris as well. Karen is phenomenal. The speculation, and I hope that Prime Minister Starmer does deliver this, is that her term will be extended beyond the 4-year term, which I think is a really good thing. She has a great relationship with a lot of people around President Trump. She worked with the Trump administration previously. So I think my advice would be keep Karen in place.
Okay, and if someone does replace her, I mean, lots of speculation as to who replacements might be. I see you smiling. I'm wondering if you're one of the people who might consider such a position. And what about Nigel Farage, who would be perhaps, well, he's made no secret of it in the past, that being one of his preferred outcomes?
I doubt whether a Labour Prime Minister would bring back a previous Conservative Chancellor to be ambassador to Washington. I think, and I said this a few days ago, to the British media, I think, as I did when I had to deploy the vaccine for the UK, I vaccinated the United Kingdom, I was the vaccine deployment minister, and one of my sort of pivotal decisions was to put party politics aside and work with Sadiq Khan in London, with Andy Burnham, another Labour mayor in Manchester, with Andy Street, a Conservative mayor in Birmingham, with the Scottish Nationalist Party in Scotland, because they were the governing party, and Labour in Wales. If I were Keir Starmer, I would bring Nigel Farage into Downing Street, set him a task to say, come and help your country, you're now a member of Parliament, and deliver a comprehensive trade agreement with the United States of America. Because of his close relationship, deep relationship with Donald Trump, I think it would be something that would be very difficult for Nigel to turn away from. And I think if Keir Starmer was a big Prime Minister, I would certainly offer that opportunity to Nigel Farage.
And what about, okay, someone like Boris Johnson's probably seen this incredible comeback in the form of the second Trump presidency. Do you think he's calculating in his own mind, thinking, well, if Donald Trump can do it, perhaps I can do it too?
Well, if you follow social media and saw his message to our new leader, Kemi Badenoch, which was clear and unambiguous support for Kemi Badenoch, and that Kemi will lead the party and lead the party to a general election victory. My prediction is that unless Labour deals with illegal migration and the very high numbers of legal migration to the United Kingdom and the pain of the economy, and this budget has not helped, the recent budget from the British Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, has not helped, they may be a one-term government, and I suspect that we will see Kemi Badenoch as Prime Minister next time round.
And you still identify with the Conservative Party? You
I
say
do.
we,
yes.
Our party, that's
yes.
with whom you still identify?
Very much so.
We don't have much time left, but I've got in front of me here your book, The Boy from Baghdad, From Waziriya to Westminster.
Beautifully pronounced.
Was it? Thank you very much. It came out a couple of weeks ago.
It did.
And of course, Waziriya is a reference to where you were born and where you grew up. It's a suburb of Baghdad, I believe.
That's correct.
How do you feel about Donald Trump's pledges, being from the region, to fix the situation in the Middle East? Do you think he's capable of doing that?
I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful because I think in many ways what the region has lacked is clarity from Washington. Let me be honest with you. I was deeply disappointed at the time when President Obama said that there would be a red line not to be crossed in Syria, and then he allowed it to be crossed with the use of chemical weapons. I was deeply disappointed with the JCPOA. I was one of the MPs in Parliament who spoke out about trying to get Iran to not just talk about the nuclear portfolio, but also about the proxies and the malign influence of those proxies across the region, which has taken us to this place, whether it's Hamas or Hezbollah. None of that happened under the presidency of Barack Obama. I think President Trump will be very different and will be very clear in what he will want to see happen in the region. And we have to take him at his word. He says he will end these wars. And I wish him luck in delivering that. We need to see, I think, the Palestinian people have a better future. They deserve a better future. They deserve better government. And I hope President Trump will lean into that, as well as making sure that the hostages are returned.
Nadim Zadhawi, we have really loved having you on. Thank you so much for your time and very excited to read this book. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
My pleasure.
Great to see you.
Many former members of Team Trump 2016 could find themselves back in the White House following the inauguration in January next year. Well, especially those who've criticised the treatment Trump has endured during his legal cases. Well, former Republican Congressman George Santos has continued to show support for his former president, who he worked with in the last administration. And earlier this year, publicly made a pitch to work for Trump's administration as a director of Immigration and Customs Enforcement.
But could former Republican Congressman George Santos be one of them? Well, let's speak to him now. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, Mr. Santos. You, of course, have some legal woes of your own, but let's focus on Donald Trump, who's got plenty of legal issues hanging over him. How do you think he's managed to pull off this second non-consecutive term at the White House?
Well, Tom and Laura, thank you so much for having me. I think, look, the American people are the reason President Trump is now President-elect Trump once again. I think it was clear evidence that the American people didn't buy the lawfare wagered against the former president, now president-elect. And overkill from the Democrats and the Biden-Harris administration displayed that they had disdain for the rule of law and that they had no problem weaponizing government. That is why President Trump was able to overcome not only his legal weaponized charges, but also to convince Americans all across the country and flip every single swing state in his favor, from the Rust Belt all the way to the Arizona and Nevada desert. I think it's very telling that the American people saw right through the weaponized government and the lack of delivery for the American people that the Biden administration had.
Okay, now one of the big stories of today, of course, has been the trickle of announcements regarding top jobs in the Trump administration. Just curious to know, have you been in touch with anyone in the Team Trump?
I have not. I have barely slept over the last 72 hours as I've been doing a lot of these coverages. I was covering the story internationally, the election internationally on election night in the UK. And I've been doing a set of these interviews because I think it's important to communicate to the entire world. The United States is back. We are back with peace. We are back with resolve to solve the chaos and fire that the world is on. So I have not had yet time to speak to anybody in Team Trump, but I look forward to speaking to them in due time.
Earlier on in the year, I think you said, and correct me if I'm wrong, you'd like to head up ICE, which is, of course, the immigration body. And clearly immigration was such a huge issue on the campaign trail. Now, were you to get that job, how would you approach it? And in particular, there's this challenge that Donald Trump has set out regarding mass deportations. I just want to know how you see that working.
Look, I look at it this way. The United States today has approximately 3 million people with removal proceedings letters. These means these are people who had their immigration courts heard, their immigration cases, heard and adjudicated by an immigration judge, and they've gone through the appeal process and it's been turned down, and they are set for removals proceedings. Based on our honor system, they have yet to self-deport. So I think it's only fair to say that it wouldn't be too much of a burdensome job to find those who have actually had their day in court and do not meet the standards or qualifications to remain in this country permanently or lawfully, and to remove them. And that on its own should be a lot of time. And on the latter part of your question, with all the other immigrants and immigrant issues we've had under the last 4 years, this disastrous border crisis, it's a sensible touch and go position. However, we will probably be working as a team, as Republicans in government with control of every branch of government, to find resolutions and solutions to give these people peace of mind that we will try to find remedies to perhaps create paths to residency for them. However, nothing is guaranteed, because at the end of the day, everything will pin back to who you are as an individual. So these cases will be looked individually. ICE's job is not so hard. You have 3 million people, get them gone. They do not belong in the United States. And I think that's a fair statement for any sovereign nation that's trying to protect its sovereignty. If you give these people the right to an adjudication and they fail to adjudicate it in the court of law and they have a negative outcome, they should be removed.
Mr. Santos, how will you deal with officials that refuse to cooperate, like the governor of Massachusetts, Maura Healey? She says she won't comply.
Well, it's not a matter of complying. ICE has the authority and autonomy to operate in all 50 states. It's a federal agency. She cannot shut them down. Clearly, she won't help us with local law enforcement sharing data or actually doing ICE holds in, minor domestic disputes where they end up in custody overnight for, nonsense. However, we don't need the cooperation. We have the information. The federal government has the ability to track and settle down those people. And there's targeted communities with clusters all around the country that are hotspots and hotbeds for the cluster of these people with removals proceedings levied against them. So it doesn't matter when you have the governor of Massachusetts or California saying they won't comply. ICE still has the constitutional authority to operate in those states.
Is the return of Donald Trump good or bad news for America?
I think that Donald Trump is the best news for America and the best news for the world. The Middle East is on fire. Donald Trump got elected, and a day after, you see Hamas already starting to call for we should go into a ceasefire. I mean, this couldn't be clearer that peace through strength is important, and that people like Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis are going to be scared of a President Trump presidency, as well as the Ayatollah. Tehran's on the run. They don't know what to do. They're absolutely frightened that Trump's return to the White House. And that's the best outcome for global peace.
I just want to ask you, Mr. Santos, about something on the campaign trail that seemed to be a big deal at the time. Obviously, it feels like a distant memory now. I'm talking about Garbagegate. And I just want to ask you why you think Garbagegate ultimately really didn't seem to have a huge amount of impact on Trump. Obviously, he won, and he also won quite conclusively amongst various demographics, including certain demographics of Latino voter.
Well, look, as a Latino voter myself, I can say it was a bad taste comedy done by a comic who had no business being at a campaign rally. That said, those were not the words or sentiment of President Trump displayed throughout the course of his first presidency or the entirety of this campaign that lasted a whopping 2 years. But the reality is that Democrats were grasping for air at any possibility of trying to derail the campaign. But here's the problem. Following that, President Biden turned around and called President Trump and his supporters, which is largely half of America, garbage. The sitting president of the United States, in the sense of Garbagegate, called half of the American population garbage. So a lot of these things backfired because the reality is they weren't hiding their true sentiments, and they were trying to tie other people's speeches to President Trump, and it failed.
Trump's also been talking about facing an enemy from within. Who or what is he referring to here?
Well, I believe it's the radical administration of Biden-Harris who weaponized government, not against only him, but all of their political enemies and rivals, which that does make them the enemy within. But I don't think that means that's the American people. I think that's an administration of rogue individuals willing to do what it takes to win political office. And that does become a threat to democracy. Unlike them calling President Trump a threat to democracy, they displayed threatening behavior and actions to our democracy here in America. But today, America wakes up every single day up until January 20th, a day closer back to restoring common sense, freedom, and peace through strength around the world.
Donald Trump says he's planning to dismantle what he's calling the deep state. And I've seen some things on your X feed that suggest perhaps you actually agree with that. And if that is the case, perhaps you could tell us what dismantling the deep state actually would entail.
The expectation is that by the end of fiscal year 2025, 50% of the bureaucratic state of America is dismantled by seeing redundancies being cut, excess waste of taxpayer dollars into frivolous salaries being cut, and reducing our deficit so that we can stop imploding our debt, which is a balloon to $35 trillion at this point. So it's a matter of cleaning house, having an efficiently run government, tight with close margins and little waste. So that's why I'm very enthusiastically excited to see the DOGE Department of Government Efficiency, head up by Elon Musk, be enacted, because that's exactly what they will do. And that's the expectation that I and many Americans have, is to reduce the size of the federal government.
Okay, so when we hear rumors about this so-called enemies list, I'm just curious to know what your take is on that, and who you think should perhaps be most worried about its existence.
Well, look, I don't think there's a real enemy list. There's no Gestapo type approach to this. The reality is President Trump's just going to move on and govern for the American people. Democrats want to levy that ideology that, oh, he has a Gestapo list and he's going to try to settle scores. I actually highly doubt that will happen. And I highly doubt that he'll allow his attorney general to weaponize the office of the attorney general and the Department of Justice against Joe Biden or Kamala Harris or any of his former political rivals. I think this is about moving forward. And I think that's exactly what President Trump is going to do.
He's been talking a lot about uniting the country. How is he planning on doing this?
Well, I think he showed that throughout the campaign. Tulsi Gabbard, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., podcast superstar Joe Rogan. These are all people who ideologically have sparred with President Trump in the past. I mean, and in some cases have even voted to impeach him. The reality is that he's been able to join these people together on a common sense wagon. And I think what we saw was an enormous growth of various coalitions across the country in growing to support President Trump based on unity. This was the great unity tour. This was the great unity ticket. And we totally show that when the American people complied and subscribed to the unity ideology that the Trump campaign was presenting to them. And therefore, I think President Trump will continue on that beat moving forward as he continues to embody and embrace everyone and every single person of every political and ideology within the spectrum.
And what's the likelihood that we'll see a more, let's say, serious Donald Trump this time around?
Well, look, if Donald Trump becomes too serious, he ceases to be Donald Trump. Donald Trump is by de facto an entertainer, right? But he's also a great businessman, a titan who rebuilt the skyline of Manhattan in New York City. So the way I'll put it to you is, I think we already have a serious Donald Trump. We're just going to have a more intelligent Donald Trump who knows how the government works this time around, more so than he did in 2016, not allowing himself to be swamped by swamp characters and creatures within his administration. So a first good sign of that is the appointment of Susie Wild, the first ever female chief of staff to the President of the United States.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Republican Congressman George Santos, thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thank you, Tom.
As well as his loyal group of supporters, many members of the last Trump administration may have found themselves outside his circle of trust and even on the so-called enemy list, including the former US National Security Advisor John Bolton, who had this to say about his former boss when asked about him back on Al Arabiya in September.
Well, you know, Trump says openly that he thinks his personal relations with the head of state, particularly of American adversaries, are an exact description of the state-to-state relationships between the United States and that other country, North Korea or whatever. That's completely wrong. There's certainly a role for personal relations and international affairs, but these hard men, Putin, Xi, Kim, they know what their national interests are, and that's what they pursue. They're not pursuing personal relations. I've been in rooms with Trump and all three of them at different times, and know them otherwise. Look, I think they believe Trump is a laughing fool, and they will take advantage of him accordingly, and that's dangerous for the United States, obviously.
Okay, well, we can speak now to Ambassador John Bolton, who we just heard there in that clip, who is, of course, the former US National Security Advisor. Ambassador, thank you very much indeed for joining us. It's been 2 months, roughly, since we spoke to you last. Do you stand by the comments you made when you spoke to us last time?
Sure. Trump hasn't changed in that period, and now that he's won election, I think we're going to see an intensification of efforts by foreign leaders to influence him and to try and move him in their direction on the issues that are important to them. It's not clear Trump has any better understanding than he ever did before of what these issues really involve, what the stakes are, what the risks are. But it's never deterred him from engaging in the past, because he just doesn't think things like factual information or those sorts of variables really mean anything. He does think it's all about personal relations.
And Mr. Bolton, how did you react when the news came in that Donald Trump had won a second term at the White House?
Well, I was asleep, actually. I could see the direction things were moving in, and I figured I might as well get some sleep. It would be a long couple of weeks ahead. The polls were very close. It could have gone either way. There's no doubt about it. And Trump's got a mandate, but it's not a huge mandate. And, we'll see what he does with it.
Okay, so we've heard that clip of you speaking to us just before we crossed to you. You've also described Donald Trump at other stages as being unfit for office. So I'm assuming that you've ruled out, have you, any future collaboration with the next Trump administration?
Right. Well, as the saying goes, I'm not sitting home alone by the phone waiting for him to call. That's for sure.
All right. But I wanted to ask you as well, someone who was quick to pick up the telephone was President Vladimir Putin, who congratulated Donald Trump on Thursday and praised him for showing courage. She says that Moscow is ready for dialogue. I'd just like to get your take on how you'd characterize the state of relations between those two men.
Well, it has been reported that Trump has had a number of phone calls with Putin during the time after he left the presidency and the election. It's not clear to me that that's accurate. The Russians deny it, but maybe it's true. I think that Trump felt he had a very good personal friendship with Putin. I don't think that's how Putin saw it. As I said a couple of months ago, he thinks Trump's an easy mark. It's somebody he can take advantage of. He knows how to manipulate him. He uses flattery and other techniques to get what he wants from Russia's national interest perspective. And I think that obviously between Russia and the United States at the moment, the question of Ukraine would be number one on the priority list. And I'm sure Putin is considering exactly how in that conversation to move Trump perhaps to call for a ceasefire and negotiations or whatever Putin thinks would put Russia in the best bargaining position.
So if there is a possible end in sight for Ukraine, is there any indication at all that Mr. Trump can make good on his promise to fix things with a phone call?
Well, I don't think there's any chance of that happening. I mean, Trump has said a variety of things, including that he would get Zelensky and Putin in a room together and solve it in 24 hours. Zelensky has already made the obvious point that isn't going to happen since Ukraine isn't going to surrender. But here's where this personal relationship issue comes into play. I don't think Trump thinks very highly of Zelensky. I think Trump still believes this fantasy that Ukraine was working against him in the 2016 election. He still wants to know where the famous Hillary Clinton computer server is, where it's hidden in Ukraine, and he resents the idea that Ukraine was used against him in his first impeachment. Whereas the view that Trump has in his mind of Russia and Putin in particular is much more favorable. And I think any kind of interaction that Trump might initiate is very likely, in fact, almost certain to end in something detrimental for Ukraine.
And with regards to relationships, can Trump use his relationship with the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and also leaders in the Middle East to bring about peace in Gaza and also in Lebanon?
I think what Trump wants more than anything else, both in Ukraine, but in the war in the Middle East as well, is he wants it over and out of the way by January the 20th. He thinks these are Biden's wars. If he had been president, as he said during the campaign, neither war would have happened, which is these are statements that are obviously neither provable nor disprovable, but only to tout his own virtues. But what he really wants is not to have to deal with them. And from that perspective, he doesn't necessarily have a preferred outcome for the Middle East or Ukraine as long as they go away. I think the chances of either conflict going away are essentially zero. So Trump will have to deal with them, but it's not because he has a plan for how they would end optimally from the American point of view. He just would rather not be bothered. He has other things on his mind, like initiating a trade war with most of the rest of the world by imposing tariffs on all goods imported into the United States. Of 10 or 20%. It's a proposal that could crash the American economy and crash the global economy as well.
And obviously, to resolve the situation in Lebanon and in Gaza, obviously Iran has been playing a part in all of this. And I'm just wondering how worried you think the Iranian regime should be about the return of Donald Trump.
Well, I think they are worried. I think their efforts to interfere in the election were try and slow down Trump. Of course, the Russians were doing the opposite. They were trying to help Trump because they wanted him elected. So maybe the two canceled out. But I think it's widely held in the United States as well as in Israel that Iran is responsible for this conflict in the Middle East. This is not a war of Palestinians against Israel or a war of Arabs against Israel. This is a war of Iran against Israel and manifested through the terrorist groups that Iran has armed and equipped and trained and financed for many decades, not for the use of the terrorists, but for when Iran felt it was an appropriate moment to strike. So I think this is an opportunity for Netanyahu, particularly during the transition period between the American election and the swearing in of the new president on January the 20th, where Netanyahu may have a relatively free hand to go after other targets in Iran, including the nuclear weapons program. Now, whether he will or not, I don't know, but I don't think Trump would voice objection to it.
Well, the return of Trump probably wasn't the desired outcome for a number of European and NATO countries. What do you, and also the leaders, do you think their apparent sense of vulnerability is justified? Can Europe actually go it alone?
Well, I don't think in present circumstances they're capable of it for a long time. And unfortunately, their unwillingness to spend what they should on defense plays into Trump's hand. He's trying to tell Americans that this alliance means we defend Europe, we get nothing out of it. And they don't pay us. So why are we doing this? It neglects to explain what a collective defense alliance does that helps make the U.S. more secure, as well as the Europeans. And so I'm very worried that this could end up with miscommunication between the European countries and the United States, where they now have President Macron of France and others saying we need an independent European military capability. Honestly, if they go too far down that road, even more Americans than Trump will say, well, fine, let the Europeans defend themselves.
You mentioned the transition to the new presidency just a moment ago, and I just want to ask you about your thoughts with regards to the transition. Do you think it's going to be peaceful? And given what we've heard from the outgoing Biden administration, do you think it's going to be productive?
Look, I think almost every transition in American history has been peaceful and particularly more recent years, very productive. It was Donald Trump's exit in 2020 that was atypical of the transition process. And I personally have been involved in quite a number of them, both going in and going out. So it's something it's part of it's not in the Constitution, but it's part of the norms of the way Americans transfer power peacefully after an election. As I say, the only real exception to that norm was Donald Trump. This time, conveniently for Trump, he won. So he didn't invite Biden to the White House in 2020, but Biden has invited him for lunch, and lo and behold, Trump's going to go. So I give Biden credit here. It's got to be painful for him. He was driven out of the election by his own party, couldn't defend himself in the general election against Trump's attacks. But as the outgoing president, he's doing the right thing. He's extending the open hand to Trump. He's offered to cooperate with Trump's transition team. That's the right way to go. And it is an example. Maybe Trump will pick up on it.
During his campaign, Mr. Trump talked about facing an enemy from within. In your opinion, who or what was he referring to there?
I think Trump was referring to anybody who disagreed with him, and that's a long list of people. I do think a retribution presidency is on his mind. I hope I'm wrong on that, but knowing Trump, I don't think so, and I think it could cause the country a lot of damage. We'll see what happens. Maybe he can be distracted by his appointees to do other things. I hope that's right, but I don't think so.
Yeah, we're just receiving word actually of the authorities in the United States trying to pursue legal recourse with regards to the Iranian assassination attempt on Donald Trump. And given that news has just come into us, I just wanted to ask you, given what we saw on the campaign trail, so much of it was unprecedented, not least one real assassination attempt and some other attempts that were interpreted as being real, although there were no shots fired. Do you see a risk of more of the same, some violence between now and January when he's inaugurated?
Well, I think the two attempts against Trump this time are not Iran related. They were due probably to emotionally disturbed people, and you can't rule that out. But I don't think there's going to be any significant violence related to the election. Now, in part, that's because Trump won. And, he's not alleging the election was stolen. It raises also the question, why didn't the Democrats steal it this time if they stole it in 2020? It helps undercut the whole theory that there was an effort by the Democrats to steal it in 2020. Trump lost it in that election, and he just can't admit it. That's the real problem. But hopefully the transition goes forward and we have a peaceful transfer of power. I think the Iranian threat against Trump is real. I haven't read this latest indictment, but in my own case, about a year and a half ago, they indicted an Iranian official named Shamanpour Safi, who was trying to hire a hitman to assassinate me. So this is just one of several efforts by Iran to go after current and former U.S. officials and private American citizens like Masih Alinejad, who was the subject of exactly the same kind of effort. This is totally unacceptable. And I do think, if nothing else, because Trump himself understands the nature of the threat, that his administration may be more active in trying to prevent Iran from doing it, not just threatening them.
Yeah, a little bit more clarity on that report just coming into us. US prosecutors announce charges in alleged Iranian plot to assassinate Trump. That's the latest we've got for you on that. Clearly, in this environment, there are going to be a lot of unhappy people in the United States. A lot of people will be fearful of a second Trump presidency. Do you think in this context, security for the president-elect is going to have to be beefed up?
Well, I think after the assassination attempts, the Secret Service did increase protection. They're a very professional force. These earlier attempts were obviously very problematic, but I think they're going to be as careful as they can be. And in the run-up to the inauguration itself, I'm sure security in Washington will be at its most intense.
And just lastly, I mean, we've been talking a lot about the lineup in the Trump administration. Lots of announcements with regards to people in the team. I just want to ask you about a comment that Donald Trump made about you. I mean, an extraordinary comment, actually. He made it to Joe Rogan, describing you as a whack job. I mean, what went through your mind when you heard the former president and the president-elect, which Donald Trump is, making a comment of that nature?
Well, you know, it's the way Trump is. It's a kind of juvenile response. But, you know, after all, he hired me after watching me on Fox News for many years. So maybe he should ask himself why he did it.
All right. Well, we're going to have to leave it there. We're out of time. Ambassador John Bolton, former U.S. National Security Advisor, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us tonight. Coming up next is Riz Khan.
Absolutely. We'll be back on Monday at the same time. Until then, from all of us here at Al Arabiya News, thanks for watching. Stay tuned.
Good night.